Hey friends, I hope your week is off to a great start. Today I'm going to be trying out Claire and Brad's recipe for Pecan-Rye Pumpkin Pie from the BA series Making Perfect. So I'm personally a huge fan of pumpkin pies, but they get a really bad reputation because there are so many terrible pumpkin pies out there. This pie promises to be the one to convert non-believers, so I'm really excited to try it out today. I do these Bon Appetit recipe tests every single Wednesday, so if you like this one, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Without any further ado, let's get into it. So first up, we're tackling the crust by combining all of the dry ingredients. So I've got my all-purpose flour here. Next up, I've got the rye flour. Then I've got the granulated sugar and kosher salt. And we're gonna give this a whisk just to get everything combined. With the dry ingredients all evenly incorporated, we're gonna go ahead and add in our 1.5 sticks of unsalted chilled butter. So I've got this cut into kind of 1/4 tablespoon size pieces. And we're just going to dump this all in here. And you guys have seen me make pastry dough a number of different ways. So I always try to follow the method that they're calling for in the recipe. So Claire wants us to aggressively rub the dough into the flour just using our fingers. So it's kind of a pinching and rubbing method here. You could obviously do this in a food processor, you could use a pastry cutter, you could use the rolling pin method that Carla and Chris Morocco have used. So it's really whatever you want to do that you find works best. And with that, I think I'm pretty satisfied with the way that this is looking. So now that we've got the butter all rubbed through the flour, we can go ahead and start adding in the ice water. And a couple of quick notes on the water. You want this as cold as possible because we're not trying to melt the butter. Second, you want to use as little water as required to get everything incorporated. So the recipe states use 5 tablespoons of ice water and then adjust with teaspoons as needed. So I find I typically do need a little bit of extra water to get everything incorporated, but you want to be super conservative here. The gluten proteins in the flour develop in the presence of water. So the more water you add, the more chance you have of developing the gluten proteins in the flour, which is what's going to give you a tough crust versus a flaky, tender crust. So I'm just tossing the flour mixture around as I sprinkle the water in. I'm trying to get an even distribution of water into the flour so there aren't any kind of oversaturated bits and dry bits. And this is obviously super dry and not together yet, and so I'm going to go ahead and add in an extra teaspoon of water here. Okay, and this to me seems like it's just starting to come together. It's holding its shape when I squeeze it, but it's not a solid mass. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll get this turned out onto the surface. So obviously you want to be working on a clean countertop. All right, cool. So that came into a ball. That's looking nice. And so now that we've got our solid ball of dough, we can go ahead and dust the work surface with some flour, and we're going to get this rolled out. And Carla always says you don't get extra credit for not using enough flour, so use what you need to get the job done. And so first we're using our hands to form this into a 7x5 rectangle approximately. And I like to just use a bench scraper to tidy up the edges. If you didn't have a bench scraper, you could take your rolling pin and kind of ram it into the sides just to kind of get everything squared up a little bit. So with this tidied up, we're now going to roll it out, and it says to roll it out till it's 3 times as long as the current length. So this is about 5 inches, so I'm looking for about 15 inches in total length. And any little fragmented fishery bits I'm going to just squeeze back together. Okay, and I think that's about 3 times the length it was before, so we're about 15 inches. And I'm going to go ahead and fold this up. We're making basically like a little envelope. So folding it into thirds. And so now theoretically, we rolled it out 3 times as long. We folded it into thirds. It should be approximately 5x7 again. So I'm roughly there, so that's cool that it worked out. I'm going to do a double layer of plastic wrap here. All right, so we've got the dough. I'm going to pop this in the refrigerator to chill for at least 30 minutes. In exactly 30 minutes, I've got my crust out of the refrigerator, and we are ready to roll this out. So first up, I'm going to lightly flour the surface so we don't get any sticking. I'm going to put my fold side down. And we want to roll this out into a 12-inch diameter circle. So rolling from a rectangle into a circle is a little challenging. I'm somewhat confused why we made this into a square rather than a circle. A disc would have been a natural option, but we're just going to go with it. Getting some cracks here, so I'm just going to pinch these back together. About 12, nice. Okay. And then we're supposed to fold this over the rolling pin. So I'm going to bring this up, trying to be a little bit gentle here. So that went surprisingly well. And now we're going to just kind of slump this down into the dish. So I've got these clean kitchen scissors, and I'm just going to go around the edge and clean up any of the dough that's hanging beyond the edge of the pie plate. So one thing I'm not loving is that since we rolled this out as a square, I've got this spot where there's not really dough coverage, so I'm going to kind of cheat it, and I'm just going to pinch some of my off-cut dough onto the edge here, because I'm going to do some crimping, and I want to make sure that I've got, something to work with here. Do one last trim up of any of those patchy bits. So I'm going to first stand up the crust and do a little tuck, just to get myself a little bit more heft to work with here. So I'm just going around and kind of pinching this up. Okay, so now we've got our kind of ring of dough around the perimeter. I'm going to use my non-dominant hand here to kind of hold stationary. I'm going to take my dominant hand and press it inside. So this is the motion I'm going to be using, and we'll see how this goes. Then I'm just going around, seeing if there's anything that's a little bit wonky looking, just giving it a final look before we pop this into our oven. All right, so the pie crust is fully crimped. I'm liking the way that this is looking, and now we just need to blind bake this. So I'm trimming off the high points of the parchment paper just in case it gets a little close to the top of my oven. So I'm going to pop this into the oven on a rimmed baking sheet for about 20 minutes until the crust starts to brown. So this has been in the oven for 20 minutes. We're starting to get a little bit of browning happening on the top of the crust. So now we're going to take out the beans. So this is going to go back in the oven for 20 to 25 minutes until the crust is starting to get golden brown all over. We've also reduced the oven temperature down to 350. Since we're putting a wet filling into the crust, the egg wash basically makes a barrier that seals the moisture out of the crust. So the crust is going to stay nice and crispy and flaky. So to do that, we're making just a simple egg wash. So I'm separating my yolk from the white, and then take the egg white, and we just want to whisk it together just to get it broken up. And so this looks nice here. There are no more strings of white kind of hanging out. It seems pretty even. So we're supposed to put this just on the bottom. So we're not going all over, just the part that's going to be in contact with the pumpkin filling. And that's a really light coating of the egg wash, so I think that's exactly what I'm looking for. Back into the oven for another 5 to 10 minutes. So while the crust is finishing baking, we can go ahead and assemble the filling. So I've got all of the spices, the sugars, all of that prepped out here. I've got my 1 egg yolk that we reserved from the egg wash. To that, I'm going to add 3 more large eggs. So I'm using the Libby's pumpkin filling. This is what BA recommends, so I've used it in a lot of recipes in the past. Here I've got my heavy cream. You might also find this called whipping cream in the store. They're both the same thing. So this is the second dose of rye flavor, and we've got the rye flour in the crust, and now I've got the rye whiskey that I'm going to add into the filling. And this is 2 tablespoons of melted unsalted butter. And we'll give this a whisk just to get everything combined before we add in those dry ingredients. We are not trying to aerate this. If you get too much air into the filling, that air is going to expand during baking, and you're going to get kind of a weird off texture to the pumpkin pie. And then here I'm adding all of the brown sugar, the granulated sugar, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, fresh nutmeg, pinch of cloves, and kosher salt. The recipe wants us to use an immersion blender. I do not have an immersion blender, so I am just whisking it really thoroughly. Now the recipe notes that if you don't have an immersion blender, that you should put this into your regular blender. My concern with that is that putting it in a blender is going to aerate the mixture, and I think that this is looking really nice and smooth. It seems very homogeneous, so I am not going to blend this. I'm just going to pour it directly into the pie crust. And before you pour in the batter, you just want to double check and make sure that that egg wash on the bottom is fully set. Mine was, so I'm pouring this in. If the egg wash had not been set, you'd want to give that a little bit more time in the oven because you need that to be fully smooth and glossy. And we're going to pop this in the oven for 40 to 45 minutes. So the pie's got just about 15 minutes left. So in that time, we're going to toast up our nuts in the same oven. So I've got a 1.5 cups of whole pecans here. And we're just going to spread these out into a flat layer on a baking sheet. And we're going to toast these for 8 to 10 minutes. So I flipped the pecans and they are almost done toasting on the second side. So now I'm going to kind of make that glazy coating that goes all over them. So here I've got light brown sugar, kosher salt. We've got the egg white that we reserved from the egg wash inside of the pie crust, a little melted butter, and maple syrup. So I'm just going to add the egg whites to the sugar and salt mixture, and we'll whisk this just until it starts to foam. So the recipe says about 30 seconds. All right, so I think that looks pretty foamy. So I'm adding a tablespoon of melted unsalted butter and adding a tablespoon of maple syrup and whisking just to get that all incorporated. All right, so we've got our hot toasted pecans here. I'm going to pour this into the pie crust. And we're just going to spread these out into a flat layer on a baking sheet. And we're going to toast these for 8 to 10 minutes. So here I've got light brown sugar, kosher salt. We've got the egg white that we reserved from the egg wash inside of the pie crust, a little melted butter, and maple syrup. And we'll whisk this just until it starts to foam. So the recipe says about 30 seconds. All right, so I think that looks pretty foamy. So I'm adding a tablespoon of melted unsalted butter and adding a tablespoon of maple syrup and whisking just to get that all incorporated. And we are just tossing to get everything coated. All right, so the pie has been in the oven for 45 minutes total. Show you there's a little bit of a jiggle in the center. The outside looks set. It is slightly puffed. So these are all signs that we're ready to add the pecan topping. These are looking nice and glazy here. I'm not really trying to be too precise and line the pecans up like little soldiers or anything. I'm just trying to get a nice, flat, even coverage. And this is going to go back in the oven another 5 to 10 minutes until the nuts are no longer tacky and the pie is fully cooked. So we're in the middle of my least favorite part of trying a new recipe, and that's when the bake times are not lining up exactly right. So this is supposed to be the final 8 to 10 minutes. So far, I am about 18 minutes deep into the final 8 to 10 minutes. So the center of my pie is just not set up yet. So the good thing about pumpkin pie is that it's best eaten at room temperature, and this recipe specifies you can actually make the pie a day in advance. So if you are concerned about having this situation that I'm in now, where the bake times are not working out precisely, and you're worried it's gonna mess up your whole dinner strategy, just bake the pie the day in advance. That way you have as much time as you need. You can faff around as long as it takes to get the pie baked, and that'll help take the stress off of you on Thanksgiving Day. And this timer is telling me that the pie should be done. Let's see what's going on. So in total, rather than the recommended 8 to 10 minutes, I was in for 23 minutes. Maybe I should have waited longer to put the pecans on the top. I'm not sure which interval of baking was slightly off. Nevertheless, it seems like this is fully set. I think it looks super pretty. And so now the hardest part is letting this cool for at least 2 hours before we cut into it. I'm gonna pop this onto the wire rack and just let this chill until I'm ready to enjoy it. So the pie has cooled at room temperature for about 3.5 to 4 hours. So it is pretty much cool to the touch right now. Cut myself a nice slice of it. The texture on the inside feels really soft, but set up, so I got a nice kind of clean edge. Overall, I'm feeling optimistic about the level of cookedness of this pie. Let's see how this tastes. Oh my gosh. The pecans are incredible. They're so like sweet and candied and crispy and toasty. And the crust is so flaky. Going for another little bite. This is really good. So overall, I am really happy with this Pecan-Rye Pumpkin Pie. The flavor, the texture, and the appearance are just outstanding, and I really believe that this can win over even the biggest pumpkin pie hater at your dinner table. So I really hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and click subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.